Let's go ahead and jump into the message this morning where we're continuing our series on the Gospel of John titled, Who is Jesus? Because with his work, John will be presenting his answer to that critical question that we must all answer, and his hope is that we will believe in him. And we're picking up right where we left off last week. If you weren't here or don't remember, we saw Jesus arrested by a troop of soldiers led by Judas. The soldiers tied Jesus up and led him off to Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest. You see, we will be in verses 15 through 28, but we'll walk through them, and we'll just start with verses 15 through 18. Starting with verse 15, we read, Simon Peter was following Jesus, as was another disciple. That disciple was an acquaintance of the high priest, so he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter remained standing outside the door. So the other disciple, the one known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the girl who was the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl, who was the doorkeeper, said to Peter, You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? I'm not, Peter said. Now the servants and the officials had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. They were standing there warming themselves, and Peter was standing with them warming himself. So, after Jesus is arrested, we talked about how the disciples fled, but we do see Peter and another disciple eventually start following the soldiers as they haul off Jesus. And once they're getting where they are going with Jesus, this other anonymous disciple is able to access the high priest's courtyard. And while John doesn't tell us exactly who this disciple is, it does seem likely that that is John himself. So John can get into the courtyard, but we see that Peter can't. So this leads to John to speak to the doorkeeper to get Peter in. But as Peter is going in, the doorkeeper asks Peter to confirm that he's not one of Jesus' disciples also, like John is. Peter says that he is not denying Jesus. And we'll get into this more in a bit, but this is the beginning of a very bad night for Peter. Now, in verse 18, we see what might appear like a bit of a weird inclusion by John, but it contains some important information for us to know. For our purposes this morning, we must recognize how there was a fire going because it was cold, enough that Peter and others were warming themselves by it. And you may ask why that is important. Well, a couple reasons. Again, for our purposes this morning, the most important reason is that it's going to set up what comes next. Because this shows us that Jesus' trial, at least his hearing, all this that was beginning here, was happening at night, under darkness. Because, yeah, you could have a fire to warm yourself, but certainly this appears to be that there was a fire lit to warm them during the night. So the setting of this is a cold spring night, probably in April. But the fact that this is happening at night is extremely significant. And that is because having cases tried at night would have been thought to be improper. Especially a case as big as Jesus, which was a capital case. They were trying to kill him. So Jewish law would have forbidden this to happen in darkness at night. But that's exactly what we're seeing happen at the beginning of Jesus' trial, in essence. So let's go on, verses 19 through 21. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. I've spoken openly to the world, Jesus answered him. I have always taught in the synagogue and in the temple, where all the Jews gather, and I haven't spoken anything in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who heard what I told them. Look, they know what I said. Now, before I jump into breaking down these verses, let me provide you a little insight that's going to help us understand what's happening here. And ultimately why Jesus in John's gospel was brought to Annas first, who John here is calling the high priest, even though Caiaphas was the high priest. And the reason this is happening, or to help us understand, is that Annas was the high priest before Caiaphas, but he was deposed by the Romans, who eventually appointed Caiaphas as the high priest in his place. Well, in Jewish thought, that clearly wasn't proper or right. A high priest would serve his entire life. And so what's happening here is that Annas was probably still considered a high priest, if not in some of their minds the quote-unquote real high priest, if you will, because they would have not been big fans of the Romans just coming in and saying, yeah, you're high priest, you're out, and we're just going to appoint one for you. That certainly wouldn't have been something they were for. And at the very least, this shows us that Annas, being a former high priest, still had a lot of power. May have been pulling a lot of strings behind the scenes. We don't know. But all that to say, this is why we see the religious leaders bring Jesus to Annas first. This is also why we see John refer to him as the high priest, because for many, this is probably still considered the true high priest. So, as we see John referring to Annas as the high priest, and Jesus is brought before him, we see that Annas begins questioning Jesus about his disciples and his teaching, and this leads to Jesus responding that he spoke and taught openly in the synagogue and the temple. There were many who were gathered and heard him, so it's not like he taught in secret. He taught very publicly. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Jesus never taught in private. He did. But what Jesus is getting at is that his teaching in private is the same as it was publicly for all intents and purposes. The doctrines and the truth were the same in private as it was in front of everyone. He didn't change his teaching. Then Jesus asked Annas why he is questioning him, telling Annas to question those who heard him teach, since there would be many who could give witness to what he taught. Now, this may seem like an odd or maybe even a snarky response by Jesus, like, why are you questioning me? Go question them. But that's not really what's happening here. Instead, kind of like the fire pointed us to the fact that this is happening at night, along with other details in the Gospels and even in John's Gospel, and that we know that, well, this shouldn't be happening at night, that's improper. Well, Jesus' statement here points us to something else that's improper that's happening in this trial of sorts. It shouldn't be happening at all. Because the proper way for this to happen, this trial, this hearing, would be for Annas to interrogate and question witnesses, not the one who was accused. That would have been the proper Jewish procedure. There were supposed to be witnesses who could bring a charge against the person. If you know the Old Testament, it was supposed to be done in the presence of 2 or 3 witnesses to establish something. But undoubtedly, we see Annas here questioning Jesus, which seems to point to the fact that he's trying to get Jesus to incriminate himself. He's trying to get Jesus to say something so then they would have an established charge to ultimately declare him guilty and then kill him. So this is another instance of how Jesus is not being treated fairly or correctly during this proceeding. Jesus should not have been getting questioned and interrogated. They should have had witnesses to bring their case in that way. But, as we see, instead, Jesus is getting questioned. So Jesus here is simply pointing out that what Annas was doing here was wrong. This is not how it should be going. Verses 22 through 24. When Jesus said these things, one of the officials standing by slapped Jesus, saying, "Is this the way you answer the high priest? If I've spoken wrongly," Jesus answered him, "give evidence about the wrong. But if rightly, why do you hit me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So, after Jesus said what he did to Annas, who of course was wrongly questioning him, an official standing next to Jesus slaps him for what that official deemed was disrespectful. And this act by that official there was a cowardly one. Jesus was bound, so he could not defend himself from being struck. But like most of what we've been seeing, it shows that apparently no one is particularly interested in doing what they should have been doing during Jesus' trial here. It would absolutely not have been right to have a bound prisoner just be struck in the middle of his trial. Yet that's exactly what we see happening. Just another factor pointing us that Jesus is hated by these people. And he is not getting a fair shake at all. And then Jesus responds to the official who hit him, questioning why he would hit him. Because if the official has some sort of evidence that Jesus is doing wrong or did wrong, then this would be the time to bring it forward. Again, witnesses should be getting questioned here. So here you go. Jesus is doing something wrong, bring it. Say it. But what I find interesting too, and it always stuck out to me, is that Jesus isn't apologizing here. Jesus isn't doing anything wrong. He's standing up for what is right and for himself in this, which, as Christians, we can stand for what is right. It's completely okay. If you're not doing something wrong, you don't have to apologize. Now, to be clear, Jesus is responding respectfully. He's not pitching a fit or anything, but always we don't have to apologize for what we're not doing wrong. You can stand up for what is right, even in unjust situations. And then John tells us how Annas sent Jesus to Caiaphas, the high priest, whom Rome recognized. And this is significant because ultimately, even though Annas may have been considered by many the true high priest, or at least had power, Jesus was not going to ultimately be killed if Caiaphas did not sign off on it, because that's the high priest whom Rome recognized. So the Jewish people, we'll get into this more next week, they did not have the power, according to Rome, to just start executing people that was taken from them. Rome really guarded the power of capital punishment and execution. So if they wanted Jesus dead, outside of just bringing him out and stoning him, which probably shouldn't have been doing, then they would have to go ultimately through Rome and get that signed off on. But that process involves going to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin and the whole process there. So I lay that out to say, for Annas to send Jesus to Caiaphas, in essence, is him giving a stamp that Jesus deserves the death penalty. Because Annas could have ended this whole charade, as many of the people along the way could have. So to send him off, to keep the process going that is going to lead to his death, is Annas giving his stamp of approval, in essence, that Jesus deserves to die. Now, go on to verses 25 through 27. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They said to him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Peter denied it again. Immediately a rooster crowed. Now we see John flip the narrative back to Peter, who's still warming himself. And while he is, a group of people question him, accusing him of being one of Jesus' disciples. And they accuse him of it by asking if he is. To this, Peter continues his denial of being a disciple of Jesus. But then, oddly enough, one of the high priest's servants, who just so happens to be a relative of the man who Peter cut off his ear, he questions Peter regarding if he saw Peter in the garden, and Peter continues his denials, and then a rooster crows. Now, if you didn't know or don't remember, the rooster crowing after Peter's denials is an important detail because Jesus prophesied that this would happen. He predicted it would go this way, that Peter would deny him, a rooster would crow, and then that would ultimately bring Peter's mind back to the fact that Jesus said this would happen and that he has denied Jesus 3 times. This is a way of reminder. John 13, verse 38, Jesus replied to Peter, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly I tell you, a rooster will not crow until you have denied me 3 times. It's important. Peter was certain he would follow Jesus wherever he would go, even if it cost him his life, and it seemed like he was serious. If you were here when we talked about Jesus getting arrested, Peter was ready to go. He was ready to fight an army, took out a sword and started swinging. But here we see Peter can't even stand up to a little questioning about if he's a disciple of Jesus. And once the rooster crows, Peter realizes what he did, and he's devastated. We see this in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 26, verses 74 through 75. Then Peter started to curse and swear with an oath, "I don't know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Now, Peter has denied. His mind goes back to it, and he goes, and he's just crushed once he realizes he was ready. He said he was ready to die, and it seemed like he was. Couldn't even answer some basic questions about if he was a follower of Jesus. Now let's go on to verse 28 to finish this off. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They did not enter the headquarters themselves, otherwise they would be defiled and unable to eat the Passover. Now, I wanted to close with verse 28 because I feel like it's a noteworthy one that fits with what we've kind of been seeing with the rest of these verses. Now, in this verse, John, again, transitions, this time back to Jesus. And you'll notice how he doesn't include any details about Jesus' time with Caiaphas. But needless to say, the trend of Jesus not getting done to him what was right or getting any justice, that continued. I'm going to go to Matthew's gospel so you get an idea of what was happening. We read in Matthew 26, verses 59 through 60, then the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false testimony against Jesus so that they could put him to death. The ruse that there was some sort of justice at play here, it's gone. It's just the facade is gone. But they could not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. So they should have been questioning witnesses, and they were, because now, they're having their real trial of sorts, but the witnesses can't even get their story straight. There's just nothing even convincing with the witnesses. Now, eventually, a witness does come forward and accuse Jesus of something. And, ultimately, they know all these charges are false. They can't even, false witnesses come forward. They can't even agree all of that. But this eventually leads to Caiaphas questioning Jesus, asking him directly if he was the Messiah. And Jesus didn't deny it, which caused Caiaphas to charge Jesus with blasphemy worthy of death. Look at that a little further down in Matthew 26, verses 66 through 68. What is your decision after Caiaphas claims that Jesus has blasphemed? They answered, he deserves death. Then they spat in his face and they beat him. Others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, Messiah. Who was it that hit you? So, like before, Jesus is starting to suffer inappropriate abuse and mocking. Now, I want to get back to verse 28. You got a little bit of a picture of what Jesus has been going through this night, early morning, and now into the morning. Jesus here is, in verse 28, is being led to Pilate. All this has happened. And I wanted to catch you up because then we read verse 28, and it's astounding. As Jesus is being led away, those who are leading him there, certainly groups of religious leaders, guards, whatever it may be, but certainly the Jewish people, they would not enter into the governor's headquarters themselves. Otherwise, they would have been defiled. They wouldn't have been able to eat the Passover meal. And while it isn't explained exactly what would defile them by going into the governor's headquarters, we know that the house of Gentiles was ritualistically impure, so maybe that was it. But that's not what we should focus on. Instead, notice how concerned they are about ritual uncleanliness and not wanting to do what was wrong. But at the same time, they're leading Jesus away to Pilate in hopes that Pilate will put him to death. And so you need to sit with that for a moment. They didn't want to be defiled because they would break the religious law against cleanliness and defilement. But they were perfectly happy to break all kinds of other rules and laws that they absolutely knew were wrong, as we saw and I went over, in order for an innocent man to be killed. And that's just such an incredibly, it's just an incredible picture in its own right that I think John is painting here. Here are men who are apparently so concerned with with doing what is right so that they can eat a meal later. But throughout the verses, they couldn't care less about doing what was right when it came to Jesus. Why? Because they wanted him dead. Even though he was innocent, they couldn't even do a regular case for him. They had to do it in darkness. They had to find false witnesses. They had all this other stuff that was completely improper. Yet now we see they're worried about the meal. And the Passover meal was a big deal, to be clear. But they're okay with taking the life of an innocent man. They're not okay with doing what was ritualistically improper so that they could, again, participate in the Passover later. It's a stark picture. It is an incredible contrast that's being painted for us here through John's words. So what do we take away from these verses? Well, I think there are two lessons we could take away, kind of building on some of the things we talked about last week. But the first is that these verses are set up in a way that I believe John is bringing forward a contrast between Peter and Jesus. Now, we did some of this last week. We talked about Judas, Peter, and Jesus, but the way that John rotates his narrative between Peter and Jesus seems pretty clear. He's bringing them forward and kind of making a contrast between the two and comparing them. And it's very interesting because on one hand, you see Jesus, who was bold. He was never backing down to those who were coming against him. He was not a coward at all, even though they were doing what was wrong, what was unjust, all of that. On the other hand, you have Peter, who was cowardly, and he was backing down when he was faced with just basic questioning. In the verses we saw last week, Jesus stood before an army of men, and when he asked if he was Jesus, knowing they were looking to arrest him, Jesus declared, "I am." We saw that, for instance, in John 18, verses 4 through 5. Then Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen to him, went out and said to them, "Who is it that you're seeking?" Jesus of Nazareth, they answered. "I am he," Jesus told them. And remember, we talked about the original language. That is him saying, "I am." Well, then what we see in these verses is Peter stood before a few people, and when he asked if he was one of Jesus' disciples, he declared this. Now, Peter was standing, warming himself. They said to him, "Are you not one of his disciples too?" He denied and said, "I am not." It's kind of an interesting contrast there. Jesus on one hand stands and says, "I am." Peter sitting there saying, "I am not." So while Peter was denying who he was, Jesus never denied anything. But instead, again, was boldly facing the most powerful people in Jewish society. He was not backing down, standing up against those who came against him. But what was he doing? He was being obedient to the Father's will. Keep that in mind. Yes, we should be bold. We should stand. But it's always out of obedience to what God commands, not going crazy and standing up and being bold and doing whatever we want. He was absolutely focused on being obedient. But yeah, he was standing up to the most powerful people in Jewish society. So again, I think it's clear from the way John wrote this, we should be seeing a comparison between Jesus and Peter. And it's a stark one. I believe that what we could take away from that comparison is honestly how weak we are as humans. Because remember, Peter loved Jesus, declared he was willing to die, and decent proof that he was willing to do it. This was the disciple who saw Jesus out on the water and was like, "I'm coming, let's go." This is Peter we're talking about here. But when Peter was in a situation, everything was going wrong. It's kind of unexpected how he arrived there. He folded. When he was faced with simple questioning, he showed himself to be rather weak. He thought he was ready and strong enough to face what came his way, but he wasn't. And if that's Peter, what does that mean for us? So that's why, week in and week out, I believe God's word should always humble us in so many ways. And in this case, I think it should humble us to bring our minds to this fact, that we're all one difficult time or situation away from being just like Peter. That we just, turns out, we're strong in so many instances, in so many ways, but then something happens, unexpected. It goes a different way, whatever it is. And if we could look back, we'll realize, wow, we were really weak. Man, we really backed down from the challenge or the situation. Turned out we thought we were strong, but again, one situation away from denying Jesus or going a different way. Now, of course, then we hear that, and our minds always go to kind of the white knuckle approach to how we fight that. That, all right, we don't want that, so we better become stronger in our walk with God, be even more obedient and diligent to the things of God. Which, of course, isn't bad. Hopefully that's great. You should do that. But there is this sense that what happens is then we make it about ourselves. We make it about our devotion, our strength, trying to, I said, the white knuckle kind of approach. Well, like, let's go. I'm just going to get stronger. I won't do that. I won't back down. I'll do whatever it takes. All those sort of things. But we have to be careful. And we see an example in these verses of why we have to be careful, because you just have to look at the religious leaders. As we've talked about before, and as you know if you know your Bible, the religious leaders, they were absolutely committed to the things of God. They would tithe their spices. They would do all these things. They would count steps on the Sabbath. At all this sort of stuff, all with the hopes of following the law, all worried about the ritual uncleanliness as we saw. So if anyone was committed to obedience and diligence in following God, it was them. But then what did we also see? We saw that they were willing to bend all the rules and do what they knew wasn't right in order to murder an innocent man in Jesus. So that's the second thing I think we can learn. Just like we learned how weak we are, another warning for us is that we are also one situation away, one difficult time, to being giant hypocrites to what we claim to believe and how we claim to live. If we could just find ourselves at those places, not only are we weak, but then we do things that, again, if we could look back, completely betray what we say, again, that we believe and that we're followers of God. Because, the amount of hypocrisy in these verses is just astounding. And it's clear as day. The ones who were most committed to following God, the ones who were the most religious, when it came down to it, they were giant hypocrites. Because it came down to deciding what they wanted, what they thought was best, and what they knew was right. And this is what we talked about a little bit last week. So often we put the scales of kind of viewing what we think is right, our will, and we substitute that thinking that that's God's will. Like, our will, that's probably the will of God, or certainly we think is right. And we know from John's gospel that the religious leaders got together, and then John tells us that Caiaphas unknowingly prophesied that it's better for one man to die for the nation than, for the nation to go away, prophesying that Jesus was going to die. So in their minds, they had good reason. Rome would come in if people started following Jesus and may destroy their nation, take their power and their position away from them. Seems reasonable enough. Not right, but I guess you could make a case for it. But this goes to show, church, the right situation presents itself. We could start going down a path and become giant hypocrites. It's interesting. We could read these verses and go, how crazy is that? They're worried about ritualistic uncleanliness as they haul off an innocent man to die. That's crazy. And certainly we may not murder someone, but we do a lot of that in our lives. We know it's right. And then, we'll bend it a little bit. We're witnessing to our families, our friends, all these things. Sometimes we're coming at people like, this world and how terrible it is and all that. And we live exactly like it. We sound exactly like it. Our lives are no different in so many ways for so many people. So, church, these are some tough truths. But I think these verses point out these realities, and they should be warnings to us as followers of God. You may think you're strong in your faith, but there are those things that we love deep in our hearts. There's those things we are convinced are the correct calls. And whether we'll admit it or not, a lot of times we'll bend the rules a little bit so that we could do what we think is right. We might even do what we know is wrong, go against God in order to do what's best or right. This is such a problem in churches right now. We just have to look, what does God's word say? And let's just do it. And let's just trust it. I keep plugging it because I'm excited about it, but I'm going to, with the beginning of Genesis, the reason I'm so excited about it is to get back to how did God design things to be? Even things like marriage, relationships, men and women, his order of create. You could go back. It's all there, but we've been lied to by culture. I can't wait to bring in a lot of cultural stuff. We're just so convinced about this stuff when we should probably just open God's word and say, hey, what did you say? Let me do it. Oh, wow, that flies against culture and what I've been taught. Wow, that's not really what I want to do with my life or what I feel called to. Well, will you just be obedient and just trust God, or are you just going to go like, I'm good here. I'm good here. I told you before, many churches, I've heard churches before say, oh, well, Paul said that. We followed you. And I'm like, what? This is crazy stuff that people will use to justify to do what the Bible won't say don't do, what the Bible will say not to do, and they'll just do it because it's like, oh, well, that's a different context, right? It's not our day and age. We've progressed, or any number of millions of excuses, but we still claim to follow God. So we're all apt to be hypocrites. And often, that's how we bring shame on the gospel. Look, I'm not saying, and I'm going to get to it in a second, we're not going to be perfect, but you could read these verses and see these people who are committed to God and go, what? How do you get so off base to know the entire Pentateuch by heart, to have the first 5 books of the Bible memorized, know all that, and you're perp walking Jesus to go die in a sham trial, and all this, doing everything you can to set it up for him to die. And then we could look at our hearts and go, oof, we probably have done some of that ourselves in some different ways. So, look, as I'm saying this, you may say, oh, look, okay, I get it. It's a warning, but you're overblowing this a little bit. But I just think that it just stuck out to me so much. That's why I love reading the Bible over the years. I put notes in my Bible software, come back to it. Years ago, same thing. I'm just like, what a start. How could you guys do this? How could you be so committed to God, tithing spices, counting steps, and then he's innocent, you're getting false testimony, and you want him killed? That's where it cuts to my heart. And I go, but aren't I a hypocrite in so many things that I do? So here's the key. We may be strong in many ways and at many times, but if that right situation comes up, if it's something that'll cost us dearly, if it'll go against what we want or think is best, and that one situation that always happens to show up when we're worn down, when we're not at our best, maybe life has beaten us up a little bit, maybe even the situation where we know the people are wrong. We know they're wrong. We know they're not doing what was right. Those are the situations that will bring out what's deep within our hearts. It'll highlight at times how weak we are, though we think we're strong. So these verses should humble us and show how far we have to go. Because even if we're further along in our faith, even if we're strong in many ways, we are still fallen flesh. And we're all just one moment or situation away from a terrible failure or us being huge hypocrites. And so what is the answer? Well, look at the other part of the comparison that John was drawing. We look at Jesus, how he never backed down. He never denied who he was. He certainly never failed. We see that though he was being mistreated, though he was not getting justice, though it was all going wrong around him and they were purposely trying to kill him as an innocent man, he went forward in obedience. And again, he never backed down boldly. He was going to do what was right. Even standing up to say, hey, why are you questioning me? Question witnesses. That was still respectful, even in that. So we need to realize how much we need Jesus if we're going to be like him. We have to humble ourselves. You have to recognize how weak you are. Even if you consider yourself strong, again, that humility to say, but we're 1 second away. We're 1 moment away from making a shipwreck of our faith. And it's always, we talk about killing sin. No one wakes up in the morning and, for instance, goes, I'm going to cheat on my spouse. I had the happiest marriage possible. Everything's going well. I feel like adultery. That's my flavor today. No. But you begin. Small compromises. Small thoughts. Thought here, thought there. You don't take every thought captive. All of a sudden, now you're moving along, right? The old saying, how do you boil a frog? You put it in the water and you slowly just turn up the heat and then you're gone. Small compromises lead to sin. I could give you so many examples of prominent pastors, great teachers. All of a sudden they're in this terrible situation. One comes to mind specifically because he specifically said, I made a shipwreck of my faith. And you go, how? How can you teach God's word so powerfully, so correctly, and do something so horribly and bring disrepute to the gospel? Small compromises, small moments, convinced that you're strong, and you don't realize the water is boiling around you. And so what we have to know, church, is that we are weak, but we have a strong God, that he will strengthen us if we will only humble ourselves and rely on him and his strength. I'm going to throw up some scriptures here. He'll give us strength. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 4 through 5. Such is the confidence we have through Christ before God. It is not that we are competent in ourselves. That's a great verse. You're just not competent enough to claim anything as coming from ourselves, as Paul is saying. But our adequacy is from God. And then verses 4 and 5 there, jumped ahead a little bit. the only reason you have anything that you could stand before God in any way is because of Christ. That is it if you are his. If you do not have him, you have nothing. It does not matter how much power, prestige you have in this world. It is nothing. We're all on a sinking ship, right? Used it before. You could be in first class on the Titanic, or you could be in the worst class. It don't matter. Ship's sinking. You can enjoy the violins and the food before you go down, but it is death. You have no shot. The only thing you have is to throw yourself at the mercy of God completely. And even the good things we do are selfish so often. Our hearts are that distorted, that messed up. So even the good that we do, we have to have our hearts changed by God. And then go down into 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, we see, now we have this treasure in jars of clay so that this extraordinary power may be from God and not from us. What a beautiful verse. It's like putting this, Steph and I watched a movie, there was this expensive jewel or whatever. It's like imagine putting this millions of dollars of jewel just like a piece of pottery, just hanging out there. People say, you're crazy. Why would you put some treasure like that just in a pot on like your, just there? It's fun to actually read stories about people who either sadly their relative passed, they clean out their house, or someone is selling something. This lady was putting umbrellas in this pot, and it was like this priceless treasure. She had no idea. And it went to auction. It was worth millions of dollars. They were storing umbrellas in it there. And it's like we have incredible treasure with it. We have the very Holy Spirit, God, very God, within us. We are adopted sons of the Most High. And yet we have this broken flesh. We have these struggles. Why? Well, many answers. So God's power can be shown in us. We'll just humble ourselves and glorify God. Man, it's such a beautiful picture. What about famous Philippians 4:13, right? I can do all things through him who gives me strength, or whatever version you have there. No, this isn't for you to pass your test or to do better in sporting events. It is as you go through the difficulties of life, you can persevere. He will strengthen you. So we shouldn't fret about being weak. We should celebrate that we have a God who will never forsake us and will strengthen us if we're just humble enough to trust and rely on him, knowing that it's only through him and his Spirit that we will have the strength we need to make it to him. That's what you have to realize. No one will stand before God, not only in being able to boast of what they've done, that God should reward them, but the fact that we can even get to God. Remember in the Gospels, Jesus said, hey, Peter, Satan's trying to sift you, but I prayed that he wouldn't. Satan would take him out in a minute. So at Job's story right there, you could go on and on and on. We won't even get to God if he does not hold on to us and strengthen us. So some of you, these verses are going to be really important. For all of us, they should be important. But for some people, you're going through a difficult situation right now. And we all are going to go through difficult times. And so what is the answer? Is it more self-help? Is it more kind of cheery sunshine? I don't know, all these sort of things. What you need are the promises of God. What you need is to drill down truth deep into your soul. You need to renew your mind so that when the next thought comes, a gospel truth comes with it. So what I'm going to do in a second is I'm going to close with some scriptures about God strengthening us and all that. Why? Because we need to remember these verses. We need truth. God has a plan and a purpose for your life. There's not a second that goes by that he's not completely in control. So whatever you're going through, I don't know what it is. I have no idea. I'm a pastor. This is what I do for a living. And the amount of stories that people has is astounding. People ask why I joke all the time and try to have fun because, like, what else am I supposed to do? Like, life is hard. You better enjoy. You better smile because we never know what's around the corner. If we even make it home on the way back, you could be driving, something happens, right? So we better enjoy the gift of every single day, of every breath that we have. But if you're breathing, God's still working. That's the promise at the beginning of Philippians. He still has a plan and a purpose for you. And even if you're walking through that dark valley, he has a plan and a purpose. You may never know. That's okay. What you need to know is that even if you're feeling weak, even if you're feeling defeated, you have a strong God. Go to him. You need these truths, church. And by the way, don't even fret about being weak. So one of the things, I was reading in a book, it highlighted it, and I was talking to someone about this yesterday. I don't even remember, but just the fact of the matter is, as we grow more holy, as we're more sanctified, what happens is we realize how weak we are. We become way more humble about the fact that, wow, I know all these truths and I still did that stupid thing. I still rebelled against God. Oh, how we get brought low, but God's grace becomes even brighter in our hearts, in our lives. So you start with something like Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 through 10, some well-known verses. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Paul prayed that the thorn in his side would go. Therefore, Paul says, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and in difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Don't think for a moment God in his grace won't bring you low so you see how great he is and how small you are. Don't think for a moment he won't do that. I'm not saying what you're going through is that, but it is a good place to be to realize that you're weak, because then you'll realize how strong your God is and what he could do through your situation that you couldn't even imagine, the power he could bring into that. What about Psalms? We should all be reading the Psalms. They are a literal, well, it's a song book, but a prayer book in the Bible. You want to know how to pray? Read the Psalms. Psalm 73, verse 26, my flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart, my portion forever. What a beautiful scripture. For when you feel like you are failing, when you feel like you have nothing else, then you go on, God is the strength of my heart. He is my portion. I lose everything else. If I've got God, I've got everything. Psalm 46, verse 1, God is our refuge and strength, a helper who is always found in times of trouble. What an incredible verse. You're in trouble, God is there. He is always there in times and trouble. Let him be your refuge and strength. Isaiah 40, again, another famous set of verses. He gives strength to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Youths may become faint and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not become weary. They will walk and not faint. You want this to be a reality for you? Then trust in the Lord. Trust him to renew your strength. Remember, this wasn't written to us, but these promises are for us. And one of the most gracious things God has ever given us is his promises to remember these things by. Isaiah 41, verse 10, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. Do you have fear in your life about your situation, about the next step? Do not fear, for I am with you. Is your God the God of the Bible? Then what else do you need? He'll strengthen you. He'll help you. He will hold on to you with his righteous right hand. You don't have to have a good grip strength there. God will hold on to you. I've heard it said before, if you want to have the image of someone dangling by a branch off of a cliff, it's all about what you're holding on to, not how great your strength is there, right? Just hold on to God. He'll hold on to you. We'll close with Jeremiah 17, verses 5 through 9. This is what the Lord said. Cursed is the person who trusts in mankind. Go ahead and underline that, highlight that. If your hope is in any humans, in any nation, in any people, you are a fool. He makes human flesh his strength, and his heart turns from the Lord. That's what happens so often. We get convinced that's a strong person. That's that. I'll trust in myself, whatever. Your heart will turn from God. He will be like a juniper in wherever that's at. I don't even know how to say it. Araba. He cannot see when good comes, but dwells in the parched places in the wilderness, in a salt land where no one lives. The person, though, here's your contrast, who trust in the Lord, whose confidence indeed is the Lord, is blessed. You want to be blessed? Trust in God. Put your confidence in Him. That person will be like a tree planted by water. It sends its roots out towards the stream. It doesn't fear when heat comes and its foliage remains green. It will not worry in a year of drought or cease producing fruit. What a beautiful picture. A tree that has deep roots and that's connected to water can withstand a lot of things, church, and it never stops producing. And then verse 9, something good to remember as we go out here. The heart is more deceitful than anything else and incurable. Who can understand it? The heart is more deceitful above all things. Follow your heart, terrible. Trust your instincts. Well, okay, some sense. But at the end of the day, have your confidence in God. Trust in Him, church. You are weak, but that's okay. That allows God to be strong. And then, if you're going through it right now, there are these verses and so many more. Put your confidence in Him. Throw yourself on Him. He is a good